the interaction of feminist and psychoanalytic discourses in the early 20th century. And this is a quote by Freud, which I will return to a bit later. So feminism and psychoanalysis were two influential theories and movements of the early 20th century. Both endeavors sought to provide possible answers to individual social crises and needs. They partly had similar goals: consciousness raising, dealing with social or psychological oppression, repression, and inducing change. The roles and relationship of the sexes, sexuality, the body, illness, socialization, society and its institutions were central themes of both trends. At the same time, their image of the sexes and the relationship between the individual and society in general differed on many points. Early feminism and psychoanalysis did have their cross lines, but it was still an ambivalent alliance, to quote Harriet Anderson. So my presentation explores the tensions and interactions between the two trends, focusing on early psychoanalytic views and links with women's movements and the references of feminist literature to psychoanalysis in Vienna and Budapest. Just like Freud's theory of femininity, his attitude towards women's movements was also rather ambivalent. On the one hand, he expressed liberal opinions regarding sexual education, motherhood, or contraception. He translated The Subjection of Women, the classical study of John Stuart Mill, into German, although he was critical of a woman's ability to raise children and work at the same time. There are a few mentions or references to feminists in Freud's theoretical writings too. For example, in his study, Some Psychological Consequences of the Anatomical Distinction Between the Sexes, Freud declares that women's superego is never so inexorable, so impersonal, so independent of its emotional origins as we require it to be in men. We must not allow ourselves to be deflected from such conclusions by the denials of the feminists who are anxious to force us to regard the two sexes as completely equal in position and worth. But we shall, of course, willingly agree that the majority of men are also far behind the masculine ideal, and that all human individuals, as a result of their bisexual disposition and of cross inheritance, combine in themselves both masculine and feminine characteristics, so that pure masculinity and femininity remain theoretical constructions of uncertain content. So it's very, very remarkable how in the same paragraph Freud combines the most conservative or essentialist ideas and the more very progressive, modern, or even advancing even postmodern thoughts about the construction of sexual identities. So it's very characteristic of Freud, or very characteristic of the era probably, where all these parallel women's roles were emerging. In his essay Femininity in 1933, he makes another ironic comment on feminists. Girls remain in the Oedipus complex for an indeterminate length of time. The formation of the superego must suffer, and feminists are not pleased when we point out to them the effects of this factor upon the average feminine character. In Hungary, there are relatively few traces of direct connections between psychoanalysis and women's movement, although the analysis of the Budapest school reflected on women's roles and experiences, as well as the mother-infant relationship and the role of education. There is no trace of any direct connection of Ferenczi with the Hungarian feminist movement, although he must have known the very lively and very significant first wave feminist movement of from the 1910s, but there's no trace of any direct connections, but he expressed quite progressive views on women's issues and sexuality, for example, in his papers on transitional stages of sexuality and on the significance of ejaculatio precox, which this latter paper is actually speaking against the double sexual morals and its consequences to women's sexuality and psyche in general. And in a footnote of this paper, he expresses, so he prioritizes sexuality over political rights, saying that I think women are wrong to think that suffrage is the solution to their problems. It is not political choice but sexual choice that they would more naturally demand. So it's very psychoanalytic thought, of course, that sexuality is, if the sexual repression is resolved, then all the other problems are resolved. And it's, although Ferenczi was very much socially sensitive and he had papers on whatever, criminology and pedagogy and so on, but he actually considered these fields as a kind of applied psychoanalysis, and so he didn't really didn't so much include social factors or didn't really incorporate social factors into psychoanalysis, but rather extended psychoanalysis into the fields of everything else. So this kind of interconnection between the system of sexual and socio-political system is not apparent in his writings. And yeah, there are some other traces of Hungarian analysts' connection with feminist issues, like the Hungarian analyst Edith Gyömrői Ludovik, who did not consider herself a feminist, but in her emigration, in her Ceylon emigration, she joined different trends. She became a Buddhist, and she also joined the left-wing and feminist movement, the Ceylonese feminist movement, and she published a paper in the Times of Ceylon in 1948 entitled Feminism or Socialism. Here she represented we can say, a kind of an intersectional viewpoint, claiming that women's political rights should be emphasized and achieved as evident parts of the socialist viewpoint in close relation with other minorities' rights and inequalities. So in Hungary, we find connections to feminism not so much from the Freudian psychoanalysis, but rather from the Adlerian individual psychology and the psychoanalytic pedagogical and reformist educational trends. These were engaged in practical activities related to education, training, and social work, and ran institutions and organs of this kind, like journals or educational guidance centers and schools. So this field is where feminist aspects or even references to specific authors are most often found. István Mádai, the president of the Hungarian Individual Psychological Society and the co-founder of the Vienna Individual Psychological Society, published an article in 1935 under the title Women's Education and Individual Psychology in the journal A Jövő útjain, on the path of the future. It was a reform pedagogical journal. The article is somewhat contradictory, as if the author could not decide what position to take on the new female roles. He emphasizes that women's movement is the most peaceful and successful revolution in world history, with an impact that surpasses that of all other revolutions. Then a few paragraphs later he goes on to say Biologists and doctors have long known that the role of women in human life is more important than that of men, but not that of the female teacher, the female doctor, the typist, the seamstress, or the cook. It is the role of the nursing and caring mother. We must therefore take a stand against any girls' school curriculum that does not have education for motherhood as its backbone. And then he concludes that it is still important for a woman to have a vocation, mainly for psychological reasons. So it's also representative of this 1930s conservative political social era that emphasizes motherhood as a primary role for women. In the same journal, Maria Baloghi, educator, editor, and the director of the School for Young Mothers, poses the question, what does the women's movement and girls' education owe to Adler? Her answer is, Adler's liberating insight gives self-confidence to the essence of the female soul, fundamentalism, devotion, empathy, emotionality. The confidence of women educators in their vocation, but also in their femininity, can liberate today's generation of girls from their intimidation and sense of inferiority. To explore this from the other side, from the feminist side, how did feminists relate to psychoanalysis? As for the Austrian women's activists, we can find much more direct or stronger interconnections. Some of the Austrian feminists used Freud to support their own views, and feminists of the age rarely criticized his theory on femininity and his reservations about the women's movement. For example, Margareta Hilferding, the first member of Freud's Wednesday Society, was a feminist, and who later joined the Adlerian trend too, and became a feminist activist. Emma Eckstein, an ex-patient of Freud, in a pamphlet built on Freudian thought, wrote about infantile sexuality and the good mother as educator and moral guardian. The socialist Therese Schlesinger-Eckstein, who was engaged in social deviance and stressed the control of instincts, was also very appreciative of Freud. Grete Meisel has also relied on him in her writings on sexual liberation, although then she turned later a more conservative direction and a eugenist direction. And Rosa Mayreder, the prominent left-wing feminist, she was the one who challenged the Freudian concept of the Oedipus complex, suggesting that the social contextualization of the Oedipal process made more sense than its sexual biological interpretation. There are few direct references, either positive or critical, to psychoanalysis in Hungarian feminist forums, journals, like A Nő és a Társadalom, Women and Society, and A Nő, the Woman. These were the two major feminist journals. But we can find many psychological references, mostly in relation to sex education and double sexual morals, co-education, motherhood, and child rearing. An article of the most prominent Hungarian women's activist with an international reputation and career, Rózsa Bédi-Schwimmer, By the Time We Become Men, from 1907, is probably one of the earliest writing in Hungary on, in contemporary terms, intersexuality. She recalls a dinner in Berlin, where a 22-year-old boy arrived who had been mistakenly identified as a girl, as an infant, and just recently had a, so to say, sex reassignment surgery. He was lucky as he'd pursued a masculine profession before, so the change was not so dramatic. And Schwimmer was told about a meeting of the sexologist Magnus Hirschfeld, who presented three individuals of the same kind of mistakenly classified as girls, and which turned out only in their prime, where this, as she puts it, this fatal error discovered. And Schwimmer's remarkable conclusion extrapolates this situation on a general social level. Girls are raised in a feminine career to be dependent, and if later they are forced to make a living on their own, they are proved to be helpless, and they are forced to go on a kind of a gender reassignment, or a psychological gender reassignment. Vilma Glücklich, the first woman graduated in the humanities in Hungary and one of the leading figures of the Hungarian feminist movement, wrote several articles on sexual education. In her article, The Sexual Education of Children, she quotes the Hungarian psychiatrist Fülöp Stein, who is famous because he was the one who introduced Ferenczi to Freud in 1908 in Vienna. And Vilma Glücklich reports about one of his lectures that he gave at a discussion of the Association of Feminists. He referred to Freud's view that the violent psychological effects underlying most hysteria and neurasthenia came precisely from the sphere of sexual instinct. Many children could be saved from such violence by systematic gradual education. So she basically argues for sexual education and justifies it by a kind of a Freudian line of thought. And the German women's activist and sociologist Henrietta Fürth's article, The Sexual Question, points out the contradictions of the double sexual morals. And also the issue of motherhood is discussed it's mostly discussed from a social point of view, but there are some articles where psychological or even psychoanalytic aspects appear. For example, Laura Polanyi, a member of the famous Polanyi family, who knew personally both Freud and Ferenczi, and she ran an experimental kindergarten based on psychoanalytic theory, where, for example, Arthur Koestler was one of the kids. She also mentions Freud in her lectures on parenting in the Association of Feminists. As far as specific psychological questions are concerned, feminists were also mostly linked to Adlerian individual psychology. So this was a mutual attraction between individual psychology and feminism. In 1917, Adler himself was published in journal The Woman and Society, an excerpt from his 1904 paper, The Physician as Educator. Here Adler stresses that it is very harmful to instill fear in the child, to deprive them of self-confidence. At the same time, he believes, with reference to Freud, that premature awakening of the child to sexual maturity must be prevented. This can lead to nervousness, and so the parents' bedroom should always be separate from the children's, and co-education is encouraged, but carelessness and surprises are discouraged. Feminists also report on the congresses of the Hungarian Society for Child Study and publish a review of the book by the Society's president, László Nagy, as well as on the book of Mrs. Nemes Márta Müller and Margit Révész about the psychology of development and education. And also they publish reviews on the Hungarian translation of Alfred Binet's Idées modernes sur les enfants by the translator herself, philosopher Valéria Dienes, and on L'instinct combatif, a book by the Swiss psychologist and pedagogue Pierre Beauvais, director of the Rousseau Institute in Geneva. And in 1926, a long article by the prominent Austrian feminist author Margarete Daisy Minor, The Women's Movement in the Light of Individual Psychology, was published in a Hungarian translation. And this is the most explicit example of the linking of the two movements. The article discusses the consequences of male domination, of women's intellectual and economic oppression and dependency on women's self-confidence and performance. Following Adler, it argues that mental illnesses like hysteria or neurosis, and a sense of inferiority are also the consequences of this kind of social inequality. And Adler's supportive attitude towards the women's movement is formulated and cited in this context. I don't know how much time I have.
You have 2 minutes.
Okay, so I came to my brief conclusions. So what was the common ground of psychoanalysis and feminism in the early 20th century? Well, at least in Hungary, apparently, the common denominator between the two movements were the issues of motherhood, sexual education, child rearing, and co-education. As for the psychological mediator, it was not so much Freudian psychoanalysis, but the trends and forums of individual psychology and psychoanalytic reform pedagogy, which were more sensitive to social factors, including class and gender. Thank you.
Thank you, Anna. This was really informative. Any questions, comments? Yeah, Peter?
Thanks very much for both of you. I want to ask some after Vera's presentation, but I was too slow to react. First to Anna, just a quick comment on Adler. Am I correct? I assume that he wasn't he a socialist? Adler himself?
Yes, I think he had connections with the socialist movement too. Yes, and much more, socially conscious or involved. Yes.
And in fact, his individual psychology is much more social than those of Freud or Jung or so forth. And in the light of his ideas of individual within the context of larger society, it would make sense that his ideas were quite warmly received in among Hungarian female psychologists, psychoanalysts.
Yes. There was a quite strong individual psychologist movement in Hungary, and a very socially active movement with different social, very much connected to social work and motherhood, protection of the mothers, and child delinquency institutions. So they could, of course, they could more evidently incorporate kind of feminist or ideas than the Freudian psychoanalysis, which was always pursuing for or striving for universalist ideas and more and maybe more individual, stayed on a more individual level. So yes, it was more
open. From Sandor Ferenczi was quite characteristic. It's not the demand for suffrage that is most important thing for women is sexual liberation, whatever that is. At least you argue that selfish is one.
Yeah, it's a secondary thing, and sexual liberation is the most important, and everything else will be resolved after that.
Can I ask Vera just a question about representation and what I gathered from it was sort of still a picture of the situation in the mid-70s in psychology in West Germany. And at the beginning of your presentation, I want to ask, you presented the question of why, and also you had that feminist perspectives were quite absent in German speaking psychology. That means many decades after the times that you described in your presentation. But have you found answers to the question of why it took so long for the feminist psychology to break through? Or you have the early
I made some traces, not like real the answer, but there might be some traces. So the part I couldn't present anymore, unfortunately. I wanted to elaborate how there was female psychologists trying to found a women's organization inside of the Psychology Association, the German Psychological Association. And this is a development they kind of very strongly copied by the developments in the US, where the Association for Women Psychology was funded, so they also directly referred to it. And one of the women was in the US why the AVP was founded, and then tried to take the idea to Germany to do a similar thing. But that didn't work out, and I think maybe one of the problems was that they didn't make such a loud fuss about this in the association, because when we read the text on the founding of the Association for Women Psychology, they had a very loud ongoing process before that. There was one people, Phyllis Chester, who said, I demand $1 million from this association. And I think the German group, they already had the idea and went into their own little circle with not being that visible inside of the association. And I think on that trace they got a bit pushed away. But it's really not clear what happened in '76, because they found the association, they also wrote newsletters, they even had their own journal, which was only published once, but still. And they wanted to do a women's panel at the Congress, but that never happened. So it's not mentioned in the Congress documentation, and I do not know what happened there, but I know that they afterwards found their own Congress, which was not in the academic psychology, but closer to the activist concerns and to the practical psychotherapy. So they didn't stuck in this strong division between academic psychology and psychotherapy, which is usual in German-speaking countries, but they were what can we do in the field of psychology and psychotherapy that fits our needs? But they didn't really get into the institutions. And also they was teaching, which they really established.
So it remained marginalized to some extent in the mainstream psychology, segregated almost, they had their own niche.
They had their own congress, which was not really a connection to the main associations, but only via individuals, maybe exchange between the peers. And they also did some teaching in the 70s and 80s, but they didn't get permanent positions. There was a time before
many years ago.
So I have a question for you, actually. I was just wondering how this feminist rights or feminist movement could be connected to the efforts or the idea of sexual education in Hungary, especially in the case of Laura Polanyi. So if we stick to orthodox psychoanalysis, something very different comes out from these efforts compared to the Adlerian framework. So
yeah, well, Laura Polanyi was the one who was based on the Freudian psychoanalytic school, but in these feminist journals, sexual education was one of the major, among the major issues at the beginning, from the 19. Well, it was the journal was started at 1907. So until a few years, they were very progressive articles about how much sexual education and to talk openly to children about sexuality is important. And then they stopped talking about it because there was such an outrage of the audience. So the audience was, even the feminist audience, it was even too much for their audience. So suffrage was okay, and women's work and education, but sexuality was a topic that was, so they withdrew, and after a few years there are much less articles on sexual education. Co-education is a topic that appears, that it's important to educate boys and girls together. If we compare, these early articles are really comparing to today's Hungarian politics about sexual education is especially very open and very progressive. As for the Laura Polanyi, because I don't know much about Laura Polanyi's, what she actually did about this kindergarten. I think the kids were naked or something like that. This is what I know.
This is what I know too. But it's so interesting that it seems that sexual education is a kind of a borderline here, or something what remains to be taboo for a long time. Further questions?
I just wanted, I watched the Cairo conference online, and there was someone talking about these sort of popular books in America about women's nervousness, and they talk a lot about housework. And I guess I wondered if housework comes into this, I mean, the feminists and motherhood, but are they also bringing in ideas of housework and everything into psychoanalysis, or in other ways?
You mean that women's domestic works and the connection with this?
Cleaning and cooking and looking after servants if they're rich.
It's also an argument that this, if women's roles were more equal and outside home, then there would be less neurosis, and this kind of symptoms were and women's psychological state of mind would be improved. Let's put it simply. I don't know if it was the question.
Yes. Anything else to add? Then, thank you very much for speaking.